John Wayne Gacy, often called the Killer Clown, was one of the worst serial killers in U.S. history, murdering at least 33 teenage boys and young men. For a little backstory, John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer and rapist who murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men in Cook County, Illinois, burying most under his house. Sometimes known as the Killer Clown for his habit of dressing in a clown costume and makeup. Gacy had an abusive childhood and struggled with his homosexuality. Gacy committed all the murders in his Norwood Park home, luring his victims there with the promise of construction work or some other rush. Then sexually assaulting and torturing before killing them, usually by strangling them. Gacy was arrested in 1979. In the following year, he was convicted of 33 murders. Gacy was executed in 1994. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Ellery Robinson. His father, an auto repair and World War I veteran, struggled with alcoholism and beat John and his two sisters with a razor strap if they were perceived to have misbehaved. John's father frequently pelted him, calling him stupid, comparing him to his sisters. Gacy's history began between the ages of 6 and 10, when a teenage daughter of one of his mother's friends reportedly undressed and played with him. Gacy was molested at a young age by a family friend and contractor. In between ages 10 and 12, Gacy and a friend were accused of sexually fondling a young girl, according to Sullivan. Basically overweight child, Gacy was unable to perform at sports or bond with children his own age. According to John Wayne Gacy, by Sam L., he suffered alienations at school, unable to play with other children due to a heart condition that was looked upon by his father as another failing. He experienced frequent seizures and blackouts as a teen and was regularly in and out of hospitals. Through his father accused him of faking the elements for attention, Gacy later realized he was attracted to men and experienced great turmoil over his sexuality. Despite not graduating from high school, Gacy attended and graduated from the Northwestern Business College in Chicago, then worked as a salesman and manager at a shoe company. In 1964, he met and became engaged to Marilyn Myers, whose father owned 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy relocated there to manage the restaurants, and he and Myers had 2 children together. Gacy became a self-made building constructor and democratic captain in the Chicago suburbs in the 1970s. He later speculated his political involvement might have been an attempt to antagonize his father, who mocked his interest in politics. maybe it was a way to get acceptations. Gacy said, according to Buried Dreams, and he quotes, "I was always looking for acceptance because my dad made me feel that I was never good enough." Well liked in his community, Gacy organized cultural gatherings and he was active in political organizations and the civic group. Gacy later called this the happiest period of his life. And he even earned much coveted praise from his father, who said he had been wrong about Gacy. "Back then, I was thinking of running for alderman," Gacy said. "After that, I wanted to go for mayor, and if it worked, I was going to run for the state senate. I didn't see any limits," Gacy said. Gacy was a member of a Chicago area Jolly Joker clown club and frequently performed in clown and makeup at children's parties, charity fundraisers, and other events at his alter egos, Pogo the Clown. Years later, during a conversation with detectives while he was under surveillance, Gacy discussed his work as a clown, remarking, "Clowns can get away with murder." Gacy's first sexual assault and arrest was in 1968. Gacy was accused of sexually assaulting a teenage boy and attempting to assault another. He denied these accusations, and some community members believed him over the victim. He persuaded one of his employees to assault the victim in an unsuccessful attempt to stop him from testifying. According to Killer Clown, Gacy was convicted and received a 10-year prison sentence, after which his wife divorced him and received full custody of their children. A model prisoner, Gacy was released on parole in the summer of 1970 after receiving 18 months of his sentence. However, Gacy was arrested again the following year after another teen claimed he lured him into his car and drove him to his house, where Gacy tried to force him into sex. In 1971, Gacy started a construction business called PDM Contractors, which grew rapidly and became financially successful. Also that year, Gacy also became engaged to Carol Hove, who he briefly dated in high school. The two were married in 1972. Most of his employees at PDM Contractors were high school students and young men, who he would proposition for sex, sometimes under the threat of violence. Nevertheless, Gacy kept up a public front as a community man, hosting summer parties that were popular and well attended according to Buried Dreams. Jane Wayne Gacy's victims was his very first one, which was in January 1972. After luring the 16-year-old Timothy McCoy, the next morning, Gacy saw McCoy standing in the bedroom doorway with a knife and rushed to attack him, wrestling the knife away and stabbing McCoy to death. Afterward, Gacy realized that McCoy hadn't been attacking or threatening Gacy, but rather was holding the knife because he had just made them breakfast. Nevertheless, Gacy discovered he received sexual gratification from killing McCoy, and later said, and he quotes, That's when I realized that death was the unlimited thrill. Another of Gacy's victims was John Patakovich, an 18-year-old PDM employee whom Gacy lured into his home with the promise to discuss overdue pay. Once there, Gacy gave him alcohol, tricked him into putting handcuffs on. Then, he strangled him. The use of handcuffs became a frequent method for Gacy, who would sometimes tell his victims he was showing them a magic trick. Patakovich parents were suspicious of Gacy and called the police more than 100 times, urging them to investigate him further. By the middle of the 1970s, 2 more young men accused Gacy of rape, and he was questioned by police about the disappearances of others. Gacy referred to this period of his life as his cruising years. When he committed most of his murders, most of his victims were buried on the property, with several placed in a common grave underneath his crawl space. One of his victims, a 17-year-old PDM employee named Gregory Godzik, told his parents that Gacy had earlier ordered him to dig trenches in the crawl space at his home. Gacy later told police he arranged this work to create space for graves. After Godzik went missing, his family contacted Gacy, who told them that Gacy had confided to Gacy that he planned to run away from home. Gacy killed several more victims during this time period. One he left alive was Robert Donnelly, a 19-year-old college student he abducted from a Chicago bus stop. After bringing him to his house, Gacy raped and tortured Donnelly, dunking his head repeatedly in a bathtub until he passed out, performing fake executions with a gun loaded with bangs. Donnelly was in so much pain, he begged Gacy to kill him. But Gacy, instead of killing him, he let him go and warned him not to tell anybody. Donnelly reported him to the police. However, when officers investigated, Gacy said it was a constitutional sex slavery encounter, and the police believed him. By 1978, Gacy's crawl space had no more space for bodies, and he started to dispose of his victims in the Des Plaines River from a bridge off Interstate 55. On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Piest went missing after telling his mother he was going to meet Gacy to discuss a potential construction job. Piest's family filed a missing persons report with the police, which led to a search of Gacy's house in Norwood Park. Authorities discovered several suspicious items there, including police badges, a pistol, hypodermic needles, pornographic films, and items that they later learned belonged to some of Gacy's victims. In 1979, months after Gacy's arrest, his house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, Illinois, was dismantled in an effort to find more evidence. The following year, the house and all structures on the property were demolished, and a new house was eventually built on the property. In the demolition of Gacy's house, quotes, "If the devil's alive, he lived there. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980, with Gacy having confessed to the crimes. The arguments were focused on whether he could be declared insane and thus remitted to a state mental facility. Gacy spent hundreds of hours with a doctor at the Mentor Center in Chester, Illinois, and underwent a series of physicalistic tests. Gacy tried to argue he had multiple personality disorder and that his mind was split between the personalities of a contracting clown, politician, and police officer named Bad Jack. Gacy claimed Bad Jack hated homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes and some of Gacy's victims as scum, weak, stupid, and degraded. On March 12, 1980, after a short jury, Gacy was found guilty of committing 33 murders, and he became known as one of the most ruthless serial killers in American history. After the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear Gacy's final appeal in October 1993, an execution date was set for May 10, 1994, at the Stateville Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. Before his death, Gacy said the victims' families would get no comfort from his death and accused the state of murdering him. His last words were repeatedly, "Kiss my ass." But the prosecutor who tried the case and attended his execution said Gacy didn't speak in his final moments. Gacy was executed by lethal injection.